We begin in the name of God. Greetings to one and all. Welcome to another session of From the Desk of Ghamidi. Our discussion continues in the 23rd question series, and today we begin the 157th episode. What is Hadith? This objection is under discussion. Today marks the 23rd episode on this topic. Ghamidi Sahab, thank you for your time. What does tabi'in imply? I posed this question to you, and certain instances in the Quran were referenced regarding this word. You told us two things. One aspect is to clarify something, and the second is the explanation and elaboration. Whether this meaning was implied in that verse of the Quran, the arguments are presented in detail. Regarding explanation and elaboration, Ghamidi Sahab stated some points which he has elaborated on in his book. After that, we are discussing how the commentators of the past, whether they be Zamakhshari, Razi, Ibn Kathir or Tabari, have understood these verses and the objections you have raised on that understanding. I would like to continue the discussion. Ghamidi Sahab, please explain this. Bayan is a term used in our principles of jurisprudence. In our tradition, once there was contemplation on the religion, this term was brought into discussion. In the Quran, the meanings in which this word has been discussed have become clear. Please tell me, does the viewpoint of the scholars of our past stand in support of your view, or do they hold to a different view? However, in verse 58 that followed, it was made binding upon them that they too cannot enter houses except on 3 occasions. Even your teacher, Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi, in his exegesis of verse 58, has written that this is an additional limit imposed along with the earlier directive stated in verse 31 of this same surah. The question to you is, in the last session you said that the meaning of tabyin wasn't implied by God himself in Surah Baqarah, while in this case God Almighty has himself said in verse 58 that we are doing tabyin. The directive mentioned in verse 31 was a general one, and its limitation and specification were done in verse 58.
This is quite an interesting situation. The learned critic, in his enthusiasm for criticism, ignored the fact that there has been an oversight in quoting the verse by Imam Amin Ahsan Islahi.
Okay, strange.
He has written that it is the explanation of verse 31. Pick out verse 31 and read it. There, istizan, or the matter of taking permission, is not under discussion at all. First, I will tell you what he wrote in his reflections on the Quran. He asks us to take a look at verse 31 first. The oversight occurred here. He should have asked to look at verses 27 and 29 first. The directive of istizan wasn't mentioned in verse 31.
What is istizan?
To take permission, to ask for permission from people inside the house to enter the house, to introduce oneself for it. This directive is mentioned in verses 27 to 29 of Surah Nur. It wasn't stated in verse 31. Giving reference to verse 31, Ustaz Imam further wrote, the condition applied to seek permission before entering houses, no such condition was applied to entering houses in verse 31. Rather, entering houses is not even mentioned there. He further wrote that slaves and minor children were exempted from it. No such exemption is mentioned there. The Quran had just begun to be revealed. Why the book was given has been stated by the Quran itself, that in essence, it is the Prophet who brings the guidance. He is himself the source of the religion, and it is his responsibility to teach the religion to the people. He is the one who gives warning and who gives glad tidings to the faithful. وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ ولا يبدين زينتهن إلا لبعولتهن أو آبائهن أو آباء بعولتهن أو أبنائهن أو أبناء بعولتهن أو إخوانهن أو بني إخوانهن أو بني أخواتهن أو نسائهن أو ما ملكت أيمانهن أو التابعين غير أولي الإربة من الرجال أو الطفل الذين لم يظهروا على عورات النساء ولا يضربن بأرجلهن ليعلم ما يخفين من زينتهن وتوبوا إلى الله جميعا أيها المؤمنون لعلكم تفلحون. I have read the complete verse, so there is no ambiguity about anything being mentioned anywhere in it. Now I shall read its translation. And tell believing women to restrain their eyes also, and to guard their private parts, and to not display their embellishments except those which are normally revealed. So, what is it that is under discussion? To restrain their eyes, guard their private parts, and not to display their embellishments. This is being told. God stated this directive. 2 exceptions are mentioned in it. What is the first one? Except those which are normally revealed. And for this, they should draw their coverings over their chest and necklines, and they should not reveal their embellishments to anyone except their husbands. Here it is repeated so that there isn't any misunderstanding remaining regarding the relation between the exception stated ahead and the directive. It relates to not revealing their embellishments. There, the details of relatives and close people are named to whom the embellishments could be revealed. Note who is mentioned, or their fathers, or their husbands' fathers, or their sons, or their husbands' sons, or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women of acquaintance, or their slaves, or the subservient male servants who do not feel attraction for women, or those children who have yet to be aware of the hidden aspects of women. You can understand it in this way that Psalms provide the supplications, the essence, or the spirit of the worship that the prophets have taught. It makes known such beautiful words of supplication, which perhaps could never be given in mark here. There isn't any mention of istizan, that is, the taking of permission, nor the mention of the etiquettes while entering houses. It is taught her how the introduction is to be done, how one makes himself familiar with people inside the house, what should be the attitude if they aren't present in the house. All these points are stated between verses 27 and 29. It is the directives of verses 27 to 29 about which the clarification of verse 58 is under discussion. Regarding verse 31, which I read to you completely, there isn't the slightest relation with it. Hence, the argument made here becomes null and void after this. However, I will go ahead further than this. I will now discuss the nature of this verse, the matter concerning this directive, and why the need was felt for the elaboration of this directive, and what elaboration has been done for it. Has there been any overstepping of the limits of bayan or tabyin that we would discuss now? For this, first I will read to you the verses starting from 27 up to 29. That is, the verses with which this directive essentially relates. It has no connection with verse 31. The point which is stated there is that the slaves and minor children are exempted from it. That wasn't ever mentioned anywhere in verses 27 to 29. It is a sheer oversight. That is, Ustad Imam made a mistake in giving the reference to the verse. If he had checked it out, then he wouldn't have made such an argument. I said that after this argument, it isn't worth consideration. However, I would still like to clarify the point. Verse 27 begins with the point. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تدخلوا بيوتا غير بيوتكم حتى تستأنسوا وتسلموا على أهلها ذلكم خير لكم لعلكم تذكرون فإن لم تجدوا فيها أحدا فلا تدخلوها حتى يؤذن لكم وإن قيل لكم ارجعوا فارجعوا هو أزكى لكم والله بما تعملون عليم ليس عليكم جناح أن تدخلوا بيوتا غير مسكونة فيها متاع لكم والله يعلم ما تبدون وما تكتمون. These are the verses 27 to 29. The directive to seek permission, or the istizan, is stated in this.
Absolutely.
Now, listen to them and see whether words exist for the exception of the slaves or the minor children. I am reading the translation. Believers, to attain this very purity, it is essential that you do not enter houses other than your own. People in villages didn't generally take care of such things. You do not enter houses other than your own until you have introduced yourselves. That is, first inform your arrival and introduce yourself, and wish peace to those in them. It is this way which is better for you so that you may remain heedful. Then, if you find no one there, do not enter them until permission is given to you, and if you are asked to go back, return. It is this way which is purer for you, and remember that God is well aware of all that you do. It is, however, no sin for you to enter non-residential places in which there is some benefit for you. God knows of what you reveal and what you conceal. Think about this and look at it once again. Read it a number of times. Where is the exception mentioned? The mistake occurred because the exception is mentioned there. However, that exception relates to the revealing of embellishments. It has no relation with istizan or seeking permission to enter houses.
However, the embellishments might as well be revealed upon entering houses.
The revealing of embellishments is another debate. It has been told what etiquettes are to be followed there and what is exempted from it, and which relatives and relationships are permitted for revealing the embellishments. That is stated further onwards. Here, the things to be taken care of while entering houses and how permission is sought are under discussion. Neither the slaves nor the children are mentioned here. This is the verse God Almighty further clarified in verse 58. Now, I wish to ask you some questions regarding this. You have read and listened to this verse. I stated its translation too. Just tell me that when the directive was given in this verse, were children a part of it? That is, when it is said that permission is sought when entering others' houses. We have to introduce ourselves and greet them. These etiquettes are fixed. Were children also included in this directive?
No.
What does common sense say?
They were not included.
Are children addressed in any directive of the Quran?
No.
When the Quran directed arranging salah, so it addressed the believers. People of Iman should arrange for the prayers. Believers should give zakah. Fasting is made obligatory for the believers in the same way it was made obligatory for earlier ummah. Are children included anywhere? Why aren't they included? Because common sense advocates for their exception. It is fixed for children that they are not liable for directives in the physical world, nor are they liable in religion. If we look at it in principle, the same point applies to children too, which God Almighty Himself stated about His Sharia. La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. That is, children haven't yet reached the age of maturity. These things do not apply to them yet, based on which they are made accountable in the world, or they are made accountable to God's directives in the hereafter. They are not included in the directives at all. Likewise, the people who are physically challenged in some way to follow the directive, regarding them too, the Quran makes it explicit that they, in essence, are not the addressee of that directive. Just as it would everywhere be accepted that children are not essentially the addressee of the directive, except when God Almighty states something specifically for them. That is, when some group or class or an individual is not the addressee, then it is necessary that the speaker states specifically that they are being addressed now. In this case, children are neither mentioned in the affirmative or the negative. The same applies to exceptions, that is, the people who are physically challenged. The Quran states it in principle. It states the nature of this exception. When we read a book or study a science, we must ensure that its author or speaker hasn't made something his mission. If you say this to someone, applying common sense, every person agrees that different directives cannot be made binding upon people who have some excuse. I will ask you some questions. A person, for example, has become paralyzed. Is he still an addressee of the directive in which we are instructed to stand in prayer?
No, it is not possible at all.
A person is seriously sick, he can't eat or drink at all. Will he still be an addressee of the directive for fasting given in the Quran?
Not at all.
Or the directive given for performing Hajj?
No.
He isn't an addressee of these directives.
Absolutely.
The Quran makes this clear because in his entire Sharia, he considers the principle that nobody is responsible for more than one can endure. Therefore, if he declares something haram or prohibited, there the exception is istirar or helplessness. That is, those people who are under some helplessness. The word istirar implies such helplessness, where someone's life, property, or honor is at stake. In such helplessness, they are no longer the addressee of that directive. God withdraws accountability from them. That was stated. This is the way regarding the prohibitions. The same thing applies here too. That is, the person becomes helpless. He is unable. It is beyond his limit, or it is beyond his capacity that he is able to follow this directive. The directives God has given for practicing, such as offering prayer or fast, there is another principle for them. That is, in this case, helplessness does not become an excuse for exemption. Here rigor becomes the basis for exemption. That is, something becomes a case of extraordinary hardship for you. This is why Imam Shatibi states, إِذْ لَمْ يُخَاطِبْ بِالْعَزِيمَةِ مَنْ لَا يُطِيقُهَا. The person who does not have the capacity to perform a certain work does not remain an addressee of these directives. That is, God Almighty gave the directive to offer salah, and when it was said to offer prayer or to observe fast, then children, as well as the handicapped, were included in it, and later on, the need was felt for their exemption. It wasn't so. They, from the very beginning, were not the addressees of the directive. If this point is clear, and this applies to all the directives of the Quran, that is, whatever directives are stated in the Quran, if those directives concern prohibitions, the exception is for helplessness. And if those are some positive directives where we are advised something, to enter houses after seeking permission, or the etiquettes to be followed during gender interaction, or the arrangement of prayer or observance of prayer, these are positive directives. Then all these are exempted for the people who face some challenges in following them, or it becomes a case of extraordinary hardship for them. The life of a person is not at stake if they observe fasting during illness or when they travel. It is not necessary that they face a situation of dire helplessness in it. However, if they feel some hardship in it, hardship which is not of an ordinary nature, then they are given the exemption by God Almighty that they complete their fasts after Ramadan. Therefore, this too is stated in principle. It is stated, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. God likes ease and not hardship in these practical directives of religion for you. He establishes this principle of exception everywhere. These hardships are of an extreme level in ma la yutaqu, and down the line, for hardships of extraordinary kind, God does not address these directives to such people. This lengthy explanation was aimed to make the point clear that whenever an instance in the Quran is studied and some directive is mentioned there for us, these two exceptions are found everywhere. When Ustaz Imam wrote that slaves and children are exempted, so it is possible that this is the idea in mind. That is, they are exempted, they need not be mentioned. However, he made a mistake in making the reference to the verse. Both of these are exemptions. Obviously, this is clear. When God Almighty said, "When you enter the houses of others, you must seek permission prior to it and introduce yourself first." The children, in essence, were not included in it. Neither were the slaves. Why? The reason being that the slaves, as a class, were handicapped in regard to many things. If this idea is encouraged, it may reach the point where, along with the Quran, a book of its exegesis would also be required with a heavenly sanction, and then an imam would follow, who would come and expound the exegesis of that revelation. The matter would reach this point. Hence, according to me, this is totally a baseless point. Regarding adultery too, that is, it is stated that their moral upbringing has not been such that they, under all conditions, are made bound to follow them. Regarding women slaves, taking into consideration their helplessness or istirar, it was said that if they, in their hearts, have a longing to be chaste, then if they are forced into sexual relationships, God would pardon them. Similar has been the case for various other matters for them. We are aware, and everyone knows, that when several directives are given regarding hijab, there too they were given exemptions. This exception has existed in terms of their class. Their status was such that they could not be made accountable for several directives. It wasn't like the case of children. They were totally exempted from Sharia. However, for some directives, the directives where they had an excuse, it could have caused extraordinary hardship for them, or it could have become a case of exceptional rigor for them. They had exemptions for all practical directives as mentioned by the Quran. This exemption or this leave, which applies everywhere in the Quran, applies to this as well. That is, it applies to verse 27 and verse 29 too. Now, my next rational question to you is that it was clear that slaves frequently moved around and went on errands to different houses. Say, I send them or you send them, they have various reasons to come and go. The matter of children is that they move in and out in a playful manner. They are not the addressee for these directives that they seek permission in whatever house they enter. This is not even required to be said in words. Yes, if they were made bound to it, then the need was there to state it in words. This is the situation. The entire discussion is based on rational principles. Based on the explicit statements of the Quran, it is absolutely clear. However, like I said, I will ask you yet another question. Was this exception applied to their going inside the bedrooms?
Not for private areas.
What does rationality demand? It is obvious. An exception would apply to the extent it is rational.
Yes, sir.
We expect some further decorum for our bedrooms, and we won't expect such decorum necessarily for the people who generally come to the houses.
Absolutely right.
I will give an example for it. A guest comes to your house. In the present times, he is a guest. You put him up in some room. Now, to pay respect to your guest, you say that, look, this is your house. You are free to sit anywhere. If you need something, you may as well fetch it from the kitchen or the fridge. If you feel like sitting, you may sit in the drawing room, or you may walk into my study and read a book of your choice there. You are saying all this in honor of your guest.
He can treat it as his house.
Now, you were heading to buy an animal for sacrifice. These specifications happen to apply on it.
Yes, this will apply.
Will it be proper even for the father?
Not possible.
Therefore, like the first point made sense. That is, when this directive is given, rather as many directives are given, though the children are exempted from it in toto, slaves, in the capacity of their class, and due to some of their compulsions, are exempted from some directives. Some directives for them would turn into a situation of extraordinary hardship, similar to the hardships we come across. Like I gave the examples, this was the situation. However, the point was rationally quite obvious that people cannot move freely into bedrooms or private spaces. If your guest even does this, he cannot provide any justification for entering the room, that just because the host had said, consider this your home, now the guest could enter the bedroom also. It is common sense that when such words are spoken, what are the things which are exceptions to it? They understand this themselves. The same is the case there as well. Regarding seeking permission, undoubtedly, the slaves should also have the exemption. The children aren't included in it either. However, the children should definitely be taught that when they move into the parents' bedroom, when they go inside sleeping quarters, or when they walk into private areas, they should either knock the door or seek permission. This should be binding not only for the slaves, but also the women slaves. This is what we would say.
Yes, sir.
So, both these things are rationally agreed upon. This is expressed as takhsis bil-aql by the scholars of usul. That is, when we say some point or deliver a sentence or make something binding upon someone, we take certain points of rationality into consideration. That is, the mind says that so and so should be exempted from it and they should not be included. I give this example to the students. In the capacity of their ustaz, if I tell them that tomorrow every student should reach by 10 a.m., every student, then obviously every student implies every student of mine. You see, specification has taken place already.
Automatically?
That is, now every student does not imply every student across the world. When they are elaborated, this specification is mentioned. It is told that when I say every student, so this implied the exemptions of all those who had some extraordinary excuse.
An accident taking place.
For example, if someone meets an accident, if someone gets hospitalized, or if someone suffers from paralysis, So, will they be included in it?
No.
So, both these things, as I said, would be taken into consideration and would rationally be under consideration. So, nothing has happened in this case. Both these things, which are rationally included in the Quran and which were understandable by common sense, which a jurist could have explained on seeing the infringement of certain things, it was possible that some people might have committed them. It was elaborated and was told. When I go through that elaboration, there isn't even the slightest hint of an overstepping of the limits of explanation and tabyin. That is, whatever Quran has said there, we have mentioned all those points now, and mentioned them on the basis of rational principles. Keeping the different elaborations in the Quran in view, I have stated them. And as I said, that if this hadn't been further elaborated in verse 58 of Surah Nur, then this would have come from fuqaha or from scholars. This is what we try to explain, that specifications are also included in tabyin. The limits and conditions are stated in it. These are stated. It is not that the speaker gave a directive earlier. Those limits were not a part of it, neither was it expressed in words or intent. Nor was there such a scope in its composition, and I stepped into from the outside and imposed those limits in it. This is what is negated. Otherwise, when elaboration or tabyin takes place, then all these are under consideration. If I discuss this verse, if I teach it or give its dars, and if verse 58 supposedly doesn't exist, then I would state all these things. And if for any reason I do not state them, my addressees will raise the question. This is what prompts other questions. They ask if this is included in this directive. So there, on the basis of rationality, we say that such and such is included, while so and so is not included. Now see how the same elaboration happens in the Quran. That is, the Quran addresses people and tells them regarding istizan or seeking permission. The same point or the similar point which we understand on the basis of rationality, only that much. See what is said. يا أيها الذين آمنوا ليستأذنكم الذين ملكت أيمانكم والذين لم يبلغوا الحلم منكم 3 مرات من قبل صلاة الفجر وحين تضعون ثيابكم من الظهيرة ومن بعد صلاة العشاء 3 عورات لكم ليس عليكم ولا عليهم جناح بعدهن طوافون عليكم بعضكم على بعض كذلك يبين الله لكم الآيات والله عليم حكيم. This is verse 58. Listen to its translation. Believers, if you need more explanation of the directives, that is, verses 27 to 29, believers, if you need more explanation of the directives, then listen. Let your slave men and women and those who have yet to reach maturity, that is, the children, ask your permission on 3 occasions when they come in to see you. Before the Fajr prayer, when you take off your garments, in the afternoon, and after the Isha prayer. That is, they had exemptions. However, it was elaborated that the exemption does not apply to their entering private spaces. The houses at that time were not like ours, that is, the bedrooms were not separate. So it was made binding that while entering houses, if one room is there, all the people stay in the house. So these 3 times should be considered as private. That is, the same point we would now apply to the bedroom or our room. In our present culture, it would have other considerations. That is what is stated in this manner. Nothing new is said in it. Before the Fajr prayer, when you take off your garments in the afternoon and after the Isha prayer. These 3 occasions are times of your privacy. It was made clear that it isn't some specification or limit or condition being applied that God gave the directive.
A reason of common sense?
Rather, it is based on rationality. This is the time for your privacy. At other times, if they come without permission, it is no offense for you or them. That is, other than these 3 times, obviously, if a single room is there and the whole family stays there, it is not binding now. Because you do go around meeting one another. Now, the wisdom is explained. The same thing which we have just now explained, that is, The slaves have to come frequently. They have to fetch the errands or deliver goods. They have to report for duty. So it would become quite a hindrance for them to every time stop at the door and seek permission. God explains to you His revelations in this way. And God is all-knowing and all-wise. Now tell me, what is it here about which it can be said that such a condition is imposed that is beyond common sense, or an exception that wasn't there earlier, a restriction that should not have been followed using common sense? All these things are understandable to us. However, God Almighty did state them, keeping some needs in view. I will tell you that this was the point that I initially elaborated on when I gave you the definition of tabyin. And I explained that when we come across some directive and wish that it be explained and expanded, we look at the meaning of the word or the sentence and try to understand its composition. We study its context and backdrop. We look at the intention of the speaker or the author, and we try to understand the expectations of common sense. So it was rational expectations that were taken into consideration in this case, and the same was elaborated by God Almighty further ahead. Now, note another interesting point here and understand the way the Quran elaborates. Another question might arise in it, and that is, since the children were exempted from it, the children would also grow up. So, will they still remain an exception? What does your common sense say?
It should not remain valid.
Obviously, the exception was for the children just for being children. When they are no longer children, common sense says that the answer should be that. And this was what the Quran stated in the verse that followed. وَإِذَا بَلَغَ الْأَطْفَالُ مِنْكُمُ الْحُلُمَ فَلْيَسْتَأْذِنُوا كَمَا اسْتَأْذَنَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ آيَاتِهِ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. In verse 58, the point elaborated was regarding the point stated in verses 27 to 29. The elaboration of verse 58 could give rise to this question, so it was further elaborated. And like after the first elaboration, it was stated, كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمُ الْآيَاتِ. After the second elaboration, it was again stated, كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ آيَاتِهِ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَلِيمٌ. Listen to its translation too. It is stated, the children among you when they reach maturity, here, no elaboration was required for the slaves. They were generally adults. The children among you, when they reach maturity, let them ask your permission as those before them would do. So, here too, it was said that their status has changed. God explains to you His revelations in this manner, and God is all-knowing and all-wise. This is the elaboration of verses 27 to 29. This is declared as tabyin by God Almighty. The first as well as the second elaboration is called tabyin. These were the rational considerations that were included in the original directive. You and I, or an expert of jurisprudence, could also understand it. The audience of the Prophet felt the need for its elaboration, and this God Himself elaborated on.
Ghamidi Sahab, the rational exception that existed in verses 27 to 29, the conditions that applied, the same conditions were elaborated on in verse 58 and termed tabyin. No specification, no annulment, no limitations were imposed on it. Neither was there any modification, change or alteration carried out in it. The same directive, along with its conditions, was expanded and elaborated on. The point was clear. The topic of the verse was also clear. However, a very important question arises at this point. How will it be decided that whatever was stated further, that point was the topic of discussion of the speaker earlier? That was a rational exception. It was further detailed out. Who would decide this? Whether it would be me, you, or the words mentioned? Are there some rules or principles for this? We will seek Ghamidi Sahab answer to this question. We are out of time at this moment. We shall return again in your service. Thank you very much for your time till now.